Lydia Dingle Karen Blick was a woman with a guilty conscience in Friday, December 19th, Emmerdale, and it led her to make a confession. The beloved character was blaming herself and Sam Dingle James Hooton for an accident that had resulted in Kim Tate, Claire King, being badly injured, and had also led to the death of Kim's beloved horse Ice. Sam had arranged an illicit shoot on Kim's land to help raise some much-needed cash to pay for the various repairs that were needed at Wishing Well. Lydia agreed to help out by keeping Kim out of the way, and she also helped Sam to deal with the people who'd paid to hunt on Kim's land. These people expected a lot for their money, and Lydia had to talk them out of doing illegal and cruel hare coursing. She suggested they could snare rabbits instead, as well as shoot pheasants. It was one of these snares that injured Ice's leg, causing him to rear and Kim to fall to the ground. Kim had gone to the woods to check what was going on after Vanessa, Michelle Hardwick, said she'd spotted some suspicious goings-on as she drove past. While Kim was lying yelling for help in the woods, Lydia was at the Woolpack having the time of her life. Kim had arranged a special appearance by Jason Donovan as a surprise for the woman she called her best friend. In the aftermath of the accident, Ice had to be put to sleep, and in this episode Lydia helped Kim to scatter his ashes in a field that had a view that Kim loved to ride to. Emotionally, Kim said Ice had been her friend. Saying goodbye to him made her cry. Since the accident, which has left Kim with her leg in a cast, she's become suspicious of everyone around her. She suspects Joe Tate, Ned Porteous, and by extension Dawn Olivia Bromley, of having designs on getting his hands on her empire sooner rather than later. Gabby, Rosie Bentham, who was heading off to visit her mum for Christmas, is more interested in herself than anyone else. For Kim, that left only Lydia over a pint in the Woolpack, his voice carrying that familiar mixture of conviction and sheepishness. He talked without malice. It was about earning a living. It was about the Dingles' right of usage, about a tradition of keeping. He convinced himself of the righteousness of it the way people convince themselves religion is proof against fear. Lydia agreed, because sometimes agreeing felt like being useful. She would keep Kim out of the loop, she said. She would distract her when needed. Sam would organize the shoot. Lydia would make sure no one saw. They both thought, in that complacent way, that small compromises led to small consequences. They imagined the cash, not the cascade. Kim Tate, meanwhile, had already been fraying around the edges. The accident left her literal scar, a leg now in plaster, pain that radiated beyond the bone. But the true injury lay deeper. Ice, who was more companion than pet, had been put to sleep when his leg could not be mended. He had been Kim's confidant, an animal who listened without judgment, who heard the private strings that the great woman playing Home Farms Orchestra could not reveal to anyone else. Letting Ice go was a quiet death for her as well. It carved a hollowness into a life that had been built on control and impeccable calculation. The stage was set with small acts that felt insignificant. A conversation in a corner at the Woolpack about Jason Donovan making an appearance. A chuckle about how Kim would enjoy something unexpected. A decision to suggest snares instead of letting the shooters treat hare coursing like a blood sport. Lydia did what she thought was compassionate and reasonable. She talked the men down from any cruelty, suggested snares for rabbits, a limit on pheasants. It was compromise, really, and compromise had always felt like the polite way forward. At the woods, something went wrong with one of those snares. The animal it trapped sprang, the mechanism tore at Ice's leg, and the horse reared in panic. Kim had come because Vanessa had mentioned something that sounded off as she'd driven past. The shuffle of boots, a shadow that did not belong. Kim, who lived by instinct and a stubbornness to know rather than be told, rode to check. She found the chaos. She found Ice in pain and, in a blink, a cascade of bad luck that would not be remedied by apology. While Kim lay screaming, the world elsewhere was fleetingly ordinary. Lydia, without meaning to be cruel, was at the Woolpack where Jason Donovan's arrival had been a glittering distraction. The song, the laughter, the surprise, all of it an attempt to gift Kim a light for her dark. Lydia thought she was doing a kindness by making sure Kim had joy after the day's sorrow. She had no idea that the light flickered because something had snapped in the undergrowth, because a leg that had carried her through more than 10,000 rides would no longer carry her in the way she needed. When Ice was put to sleep, Lydia and Kim were left with the ashes and a field that Kim loved to ride to, a swell of grass and the open sky that felt like it belonged to fewer and fewer people. They scattered the ashes together. It was a ritual that stripped away pretense. Kim called Ice my friend, and her voice shook with the honesty of someone who had loved without advantage. Lydia held the urn as if it might break, as if something about her hands made the world more fragile. When the last dust rose and settled, Kim cried the tears that had been gathering in the silhouette of her life. But grief is a jealous thing. It wants reason and someone to blame, so it can put a label on the ache. For Kim the list grew long. Joe Tate's ambition, Dawn's position that shifted like a shadow, anyone with an eye on the empire. Trust, which had once been dispensed like a coin Kim handed out sparingly, began to feel like a currency gone thin. And then there was the will. Kim had always been practical. In the quiet aftermath of her injuries and the shock of losing Ice, she made decisions that were sharp and final. She changed her will and left home farm to Lydia. To many it seemed generous, to some it was a hand with an unspoken meaning. To Lydia it felt like an impossible battery of responsibility, and a promise no one had asked her to keep. The thought of being entrusted with such a place, of being its steward, terrified her on the most intimate level. It was not because she did not love Kim in a way that transcended the mess of Dingle life and home farm's polished floors. It was because guilt had a way of amplifying favors into condemnation. Sam believed in the fairness of Dingle inheritance. He believed that if you fought for the land that had fed and sheltered you for generations, you deserved it. He saw the will as recognition. Lydia saw it differently, less as an accolade and more as a judgment. She saw Kim's trust as a mirror seeing into every small compromise she'd made. When Sam urged her to accept Kim's offer, he did it with a blunt tenderness. "It's in our blood," he said. "We've earned a seat at the table." They returned to home farm after scattering Ice's ashes. Kim, showing a more vulnerable side than many ever witnessed, asked Sam to be part of convincing Lydia to accept the will. It was a miscalculation, a series of tiny missteps that would become a wall. The words tumbled out of Lydia before she could catch them. Guilt makes people hurried and clumsy. "It was me," she said, the confession spilled, a raw thing. "It was my snares. Ice, he got tangled. I didn't mean." Kim's face did that narrowing thing it always did when she assessed. Someone, an old-fashioned inspection that read every look and tone and found its verdict. "What?" Her voice was sharp, not immediately cruel but edged like a blade. Sam tried to take the claim from Lydia, as if stamping it with his own name might make the wound easier to heal. "It wasn't her," he cried, voice high with a kind of paternal alarm. "It was my idea. I set it up. I organized the lot. I should be the one. But it didn't land. That is what happens when a person's trust is already splintered. A perfectly reasonable offering of responsibility becomes a mockery. Kim had been betrayed before, by people who promised allegiance and later showed themselves to be mercenary with love. The news that someone she had called friend, someone who had laughed and cried with her, had a hand in the chain that led to Ice's death was a gravity that pulled everything else into orbit. "You betrayed me," Kim said. It was not a shout exactly. It was cooled rage, absolute and final. She stood up from where she had been sitting, plaster on her leg making her movements cautious, and the full theater of home farm watched as she reached a decision she would not later regret, but perhaps later regret making. She sacked Sam first. It was practical cruelty. "Get out," she said in a voice that had become thin with exposure to the elements of disappointment. Sam's face went pale, then red. He shuffled, half ashamed, half incredulous. "You can't do this," he protested, like a child denied his sugar. Kim did a thing she had always done well. She asserted control. "You are no longer welcome on this land," she said. "Leave." He complied, not immediately understanding the permanence of it in the way a person who lives with makeshift plans never quite understands study of consequence. Then she turned to Lydia. For a moment the entire world held its breath. Will Kim fold? Will she show mercy? There was a tenderness in Kim's gaze that had once been reserved for very few, a softness that could soften hard things. But grief had hardened her. "Lydia," she said, softer but gone all the same. "You are sacked. Don't come back." The finality of it was a blade disguised as mercy. Lydia left home farm the way a person leaves a house where their name is no longer spoken. The cold wrapped around her like a shawl. People watched as she walked. Dawn looked surprised, Vanessa looked determined in a way that said she'd be the next to move, Joe looked away. Lydia kept her head down and walked through the village that had known her for years like an island among faces that had suddenly become unfamiliar. She did not go home, because home had never felt heavier to her than at that strange in-between moment where humility met disgrace. Sam wandered the lanes like a man stripped of the maps he had always been given. He went to the wishing well, and the pub's light seemed dimmer, the chatter smaller. The Dingle clan watched him with disapproval, with concern. There are rules about shame in families that are both protective and cruel. Sam's bravado sank under the truth of being expelled by someone he'd hoped would understand. Kim was left with the field, the ash cloud of Ice's remains that had scattered and settled into the soil like a memory refusing to be erased. She was left with her plastered leg, and a new will whose intent she had chosen in a moment of vulnerability. She had thought she was securing the future. She had not thought how the gift would wedge itself into someone's conscience and crack it. If there is a moment that defines a person in Emmerdale, it is often found in the quiet that follows a big gesture. That night, Kim sat by a window looking out at a landscape she had always thought she had claimed. The wind moaned not with the theatricality of a soap storm, but with the small, relentless gnaw of loneliness. She wrapped a blanket across her lap and let herself feel the shape of the loss. The fallout in the village was quick and messy. Rumors were the kindling of this sort of story. Their edges fray into half-truths, and the gossip that had once been a village pastime became a court where people judged and argued. There were those who said Kim had overreacted. Her pride had always been her downfall, while others whispered about how honorable it was of Lydia to confess. But whispers don't stitch up anything. They only mangle the silk, leaving things to fray further. Inside Lydia, the guilt unfurled into new shapes. Every sound made her flinch. She replayed the moment she had suggested snares to a group of men like a scratched record. She imagined Kim's riding with Ice, a picture of a woman who felt only two things: control or being betrayed. She tried to think of a way to fix it. But some violations cannot be washed. Some trust, once broken, is like a glass that even if pieced together is forever visibly scarred. Sam, who had always been a man of action not of reflection, found himself slowing down. He sat at the pub and listened to people's stories. He learned from them, as he always had. He learnt that pride had a price, sometimes paid not by the proud, but by those who loved them. The Dingles as a family gathered around their own. They murmured plans and laid traps for the future that would, they insisted, include reparation. But reparation, it turned out, was not the same thing as forgiveness. Kim's spiraling made for a spectacle, small and raw. Once she would have used fury as a defensive armor. Now she found it infecting everything. It made her suspicious of Joe's cousinly smiles. It made her assume betrayal behind Dawn's polite offers to help. She watched people like a general watching troops she thought might mutiny. Even Gabby leaving for her mother felt like another departure from a life she thought she had the right to direct. Each perceived abandonment tightened the muscles of a woman who had lost not just a companion, but the sense that she could rely on anyone again. And yet there were soft moments that crept into the cracks. Sonia, who had known different shapes of sorrow, brought a pie and sat without saying too much. Vanessa, who had often been a foil to Kim's severity, came by and, awkward real, apologized for the role that gossip had played. These small offers of normalcy did not undo anything, but they made the silence easier to breathe. In the end, there is a peculiar beauty to things that fracture. They let the light in differently. For Kim, the world had shown itself to be full of intentions that were messy and often accidental. For Lydia, the fall from favor was a chastening that would make her fiercely cautious and quietly brave. For Sam, the sacking was a humiliation that might grow into a lesson in the currency of responsibility. The village of Emmerdale kept happening. The snow melted, the fields turned, the pub opened and closed its doors at the same hours. But the people who lived within it had been altered. They had gained the awareness that one foolish, well-meaning act can rearrange lives like furniture in a storm. Where once Lydia might have believed that good intentions sanctified every misstep, she now learned that trust is an economy. It cannot be bought or returned once spent carelessly. Kim's tears in the kitchen that evening were not just for Ice, but for the shape of a life she had thought unassailable. She had been betrayed by someone she loved and trusted more than anyone else. She had been let down in the place she had felt strongest.